morning. I'm Stephen Sook. I'm an equity research analyst with Stifel out of Toronto, and I'll be the MC for the next session here. Please help me welcome Anthony Vaccaro of the Northern Miner, who will be moderating the Trials and Tribulations of ESG panel. Anthony?
Okay, thank you very much. First off, a big thank you to Joanne for hosting such another fantastic event, the third edition of it. I was honored to be here for the first one and all three, and it's been a great joy to watch this grow and become a really important gathering place for the whole mining sector. So thank you, Joanne. Well done. Also, thanks to Joanne for coming up for the title with this panel, Trials and Tribulations. I feel that's very apropos for where we sit these days with ESG. You know, I've been the moderator for the ESG panel for each of the 3 years, and I believe on year one, we were on day one, and then on year two, day two, and on year three, we're on day three. And I think in some ways, coincidentally, I'm sure, but it does kind of track a lot of the sentiment around the topic of ESG. We went from being very enthusiastic in the industry and embracing it and figuring out what we can do, I think to a point of frustration among some, and some backlash, of course, from US activist investors. So we're at an interesting juncture. There's still an incredible opportunity here, and this panel here that I'm happy to introduce to all of you is gathered today to talk about what those opportunities are and what we need to do as a sector to make sure that we're seizing them. So immediately to my left, I'm happy to be joined by Alexis Segal. He is Head of Government Relations with Glencore. Thank you, Alexis. Next to Alexis is Heather Taylor. Heather Taylor is VP of Sustainability for Osisko Gold Royalties. Welcome, Heather. Seated next to Heather, we have Jamie Strauss. He is the founder and the head of Digbee. And then finally, on my far left, we have Geneviève Morinville. She is the VP of Sustainability for Winsome Resources. Welcome, Geneviève. Okay, let's get into a frank discussion about the topics of the day. Can everyone hear me okay? I know there's a bit of an echo. I just want to make sure that I'm coming through loud and clear to my fellow panelists. As I referenced off the top, there is a large opportunity that continues to be here, but from a marketing perspective, perhaps ESG, the term is not being embraced with the warm hug that it once was. Is there things that could have been done better on the messaging to around general ESG coming out to the investment community? Alexis, can we start with you?
If you go back maybe 15 years ago, we're talking about sustainability. And sustainability, at that time, there are three pillars: economy, social, environment. And we were talking about fourth pillar, that was governance. That was part, I think, of the sustainability. But then, I don't know why it happened. Maybe the human brain is not able to handle four concepts at the same time, but we took out the economy out of the sustainability to create the ESG. And some people think that the economy is in the social, but in fact, I think what happened is that the discourse expels the economy. And we need to remember that our shareholders, they're not there only to do ESG, they're there to make money. And we took out the economy of the concept. I think that have a backlash effect that we're facing at the moment.
I think that's an interesting point, and some of the surveys I've seen would back that up. When you ask survey investors about responsible investing, over 80% say they want responsible investing to be part. And just having that word investing in there seems to reference that there's an economic factor here and you're looking for a return. It's a very interesting point. Heather, I'll bring it over to you. What's your feeling on this, on where we are right now?
I kind of prefer to not look at it as backward looking and more looking at it going forward. And I think over the past sort of 15 years, we made leaps and bounds in terms of ESG. And right now, I think we're looking at it more as risk management as opposed to anything else. And I think that it's become an integral part of the way that we're investing these days, and it's found its way into management meetings and into the boardroom and into shareholder meetings. So instead of looking backwards, as I said, I think we've come a long way from where we were sort of 15 years ago.
Okay. It's a very important point, I think, and we do want to keep moving forward on this. But before we do, I'm going to look backwards just a little bit, because I personally feel that some of this was around, lots of term that it's not just me. We all know about the term greenwashing. There was a sense that there was a lot of lip service, and what about what things were actually getting executed on the ESG front? I think regulation has a big role to play in that. I mean, we know that, right? Regulation and ESG do go hand in hand. Jamie, can you talk to us a little bit about the role of regulation in all of this? Can it really be done in a way that really helps get true traction, get us away from lip service? Maybe a bit of an update on where we are right now with regulation?
Yeah, I mean, I think regulation has played a big part in the, if I can call it, the movement of ESG or sustainability over the last, particularly over the last 5 years. And I think I think everyone is aware of it now, but there is still a huge amount of confusion. And I think the problem with regulation to some degree is that it's not, or it hasn't been sector specific. And if you look at it from an investor's point of view, rather than a compliance point of view. I mean, I'm very strong-minded that I don't believe regulation in itself or compliance is fundamentally going to change the valuation of the sector. You know, the sector is the most highest cost of capital, the lowest valuation, the most untrusted sector on the planet. Regulation on its own is not going to fundamentally shift that. We're going to remain compliant as a sector, as is pharma, as is banking, as in any other sector. What we need to do is to kind of go beyond that, to begin to get into the heads of the new millennial investors and to give them the opportunity to be able to have a greater level of trust and confidence in this sector in order to be able to make their decisions to employ or to deploy capital in a way that meets their requirements internally. So regulation has been a really important and continues to be a really important part as the pillars of sustainability generally, but we need, not just in the mining sector, but particularly for the brown sectors, need to go above and beyond in order to be able to bring capital back into this sector and to start to deploy it effectively in order to ensure responsible resourcing and development of the mining sector.
Excellent, great points. And I like that you brought up that younger investor, because I feel that sometimes our industry, we're speaking out of both sides of our mouths. On one hand, we're saying, what do we got to do to get young investors into the sector? And on the other side, we're complaining about ESG and how it's a headwind instead of a tailwind. But really, it matters to that younger investor. Geneviève, let's bring you into the conversation. What can we do? What role does regulation and ESG thinking have to play in strengthening those bonds with different investors?
Yeah, so obviously regulations has a role, but it's very different across jurisdictions. So if you really want to push the boundaries of that across an organization that has different jurisdictions, then you need to probably work towards setting your own standards, and that's where having incentives throughout a company saying, yes, in this jurisdiction, it might be these regulations, but we really want to push continuous improvement at all times. So we're going to look at it from a wholesome perspective to see where can we go next to always ensure continuous improvement. And I think it's important that a company sets its values where it wants to be and then actually deliver on the milestones that it actually is hoping to achieve so that it can always push for excellence. So that's going beyond regulations.
Okay.
Can I jump in here for a second, Anthony? I think from a regulation standpoint for corporates, I think what it's helping to do is act as guidelines for best practices in a space that can be frankly so overwhelming. And then from the investor standpoint, I think what the regulations can do is help with, standardization and consistency and comparability.
Yeah, and I mean, Alexis, you're with a big company, right? There's a lot of things that you have to deal with that a smaller company might not have to do. What is the current state right now in terms of auditing standards, in terms of keeping in compliance? Is it getting efficient? Is it getting better? Or is it still just a big heavy sigh when you see it?
There's a lot of auditing and auditors that audit the auditors and so on. When we are in multiple commodities, you have the copper marks, the gold standard, TSM in Canada that is doing a good job to, I think, audit the ESG performance of Canadian mines. But we need to get some convergence on it because, most of the standards are looking for the same thing. And sometimes we need definitely to make sure that we have, less different standards, so each one of us, we can focus on what is really important. It's not having 5 audits per day or per year, but having one solid and then we can progress, because all this process is built on continuous improvement.
Yes.
That's what we want to reach. It's not really to have a little star in your cahier. It's how can we improve year after year? How can we make sure that all our management is convinced and engaged in improving our environment, social, and governance standards? So that it's not the multiplication of standards that count. It's the rigor in which it triggers the continuous improvement.
Right. And we are seeing, I mean, ICMM, World Gold, as you've referenced, World Gold Council, Copper Mark, and Mining Association of Canada are converging on standards. They hope to have something out later this year. Jamie, over to you. How much of a difference will that make? How buoyed are you to see what those four important associations are doing?
I mean, you've got to celebrate it. I mean, you know, anything to remove the confusion has got to be a win. And the mining sector has come together to bring a number of important global standards together to create something which is therefore more consistent and therefore enabled to hopefully, and I think this is an area which maybe others on the panel can talk more to me, is hopefully appropriate for all parts of the industry, because there's so much difference between the producers and the explorers, and therefore we'll have to wait to see exactly what comes out of this. But I think at the end of the day, what we need is efficiency, and I think this convergence is efficiency. We need relevancy, whether or not it's at the top to the bottom, jurisdiction-wise, ultimately aiming for best practice, and obviously sector-specific, which this does do. And lastly, we need accessibility. And I think the accessibility is a complex discussion, because how do investors use it? How do miners use it? How do we converge those two? How do we ultimately get to where we want to get to, which is more money coming into this sector, which is driving sustainable development and production in order to get more critical minerals out, and also supporting other parts of the mining spectrum. And how can we effectively bring that forward with this and other tools, which therefore brings those investors in and highlights confidence.
Okay. I'd also like, sorry, Geneviève?
Yeah, I was just going to add, because you mentioned there's difference between producers and explorers, and in Quebec, the Quebec Mineral Exploration Association, they essentially created standards for exploration companies, and called Ecologo, and at least this is a base and it's fit for purpose for the activities you're undertaking, but it's at least setting the foundation for later on. If a company was to acquire one of these companies, at least you're trying to set the path forward for being responsible in your activities, and it's even setting standards for the suppliers of the exploration company. So that makes it interesting for us, for example, as a young company, we're in the process now of trying to adopt all the different standards associated with the certification, and then ultimately there is an auditing process which then gets prepared for, you know, a larger company type environment, which has all its own certifications that you may have to do, but it's at least the core things. It's governance, it's environment, health and safety, community, the importance of having good procurement practices, for example. So it captures what we should be caring about, you know, as you grow into an actual developer. So.
If I could just add on to one thing, I think that's brilliant, because I think so many people come to me and say, does an exploration company really need to worry about this at the moment? And I mean, let's not go on a long-winded story of it, but absolutely, this is the heart of social license. This is where it all begins.
100%,
and if you take it further from that, we can create brands in this sector. Mm-hmm. You know, there are companies in the industry that have created brands, and there is a management premium that can be put to that. And brands are typically, if you look at it, based on, I mean, if you look at a typical company on the Fortune 500 company, 60% of the market cap is often recognized down to brand value. And this sector doesn't create brands. It has one or two or a few. And the opportunity to create that through sustainability, through good practice and execution, if you were just listening to Gwen on the previous presentation, really kind of nailing in on execution of how we're going to effectively get over the pure gold situation that went on. This is how we create brands, so that there's a consistency to the whole process. And the structure of sustainability operates that, and it begins right at the beginning at the exploration level.
I would argue that Osisko has created its own brand.
What was that?
I said I would argue that Osisko has created its own brand.
Yeah.
No
I didn't mention any in particular.
No question about that. But I like that we've moved to exploration, because ESG means it's not a one-size-fits-all. It means different things at different stages of development.
Yes.
We know how critical exploration is. We have the Legends panel on Monday talking about the dearth of money that's flowing into exploration and what the consequences of that are. So let's use that as a bit of a jumping point. Alexis, you're in a unique position here, sitting at Glencore, seeing this whole kind of industry from where you sit. What are some of the challenges at that exploration level? Do you see things with explorers that maybe creates problems for themselves, or things they could do a little bit better to get on top of this file?
The challenge for a company like us is we have systems that are designed for large mines and large smelters and refineries. And when you try to translate those systems in a small team on the ground, they don't fit.
Right.
So that's where it's so important that we infuse I would say, the values of ESG in the teams doing the exploration, and not necessarily the systems that are too heavy. So that's where I think that for a company like us is to pick the right people, so they bring with them the value of environment and social engagement in exploration.
So if those principles are instilled, then that's kind of the baseline for it, and it applies in different situations. Okay, great. Heather, you know, you've had a career where you've spanned a lot, you've done a lot of work in capital markets, so I think you're in a good position for this next one. So I want to switch our perspective just slightly and look at it more as best we can from the perspective of the investor, especially the institutional investor. I'd like to get your comments around how that is evolving, if you've noticed changes there on how investors are thinking about it. And even in relation to now this topic, are investors thinking about ESG differently for different stages of development? How does that look like?
There's a lot there. So I think as a royalty and streaming company, we're in an interesting position because we have investors in our company, but we are also investors in our mining partners as well, right? But I would say that the expectations from investors are becoming more sophisticated and integral to those investment decisions, and there's no doubt about that. Some things that we are seeing is a greater emphasis on transparency and regular reporting, increased accountability, so a higher degree of ESG into corporate governance and decision-making processes, and then also starting to see the expectations of sort of KPIs and ESG going into those sort of metrics and executive compensation. You're seeing enhanced stakeholder engagement, and that's not just engagement with what they want to see with the local communities, but also the employees and other stakeholders. And then finally, I would say a greater push for not necessarily adoption, but alignment with the global standards like GRI, like SASB, like TCFD or ISSB, and then eventually probably TFND. Not to throw the total alphabet soup of acronyms at them.
Well, that again speaks to what people say is one of the problems, that there is all these
There's
standards.
so many, yeah.
We've talked about convergence with ICMM and MAC and all those ones, but are they moving towards convergence to all those standards you just referenced?
I mean, TCFD is basically dissolved into ISSB, but I think that's what I'm hopeful right now, is that there's a global framework that we're moving towards. And I don't think there's going to be one standard. I don't think that's realistic, but moving towards something that you know, ISSB, S2, I think countries around the world are all starting to adopt.
Okay. One theme that's kind of emerged in the whole ESG discussion is biodiversity. And with the mining sector, it seems to be one that we could have some fruitful discussions around, because we often have large swaths of land and we're only operating on a small part of them. Geneviève, you're in an interesting, Winsome's in an interesting part of Quebec. There's a lot of land there. Talk to us a little bit about maybe what the opportunity or what the trials are around biodiversity.
Yeah, I mean, we're in a remote environment, so it's nature. I mean, we're in remote environments. We have caribou, we've got, you know, tons of water everywhere, wetlands and all that, so those are opportunities to obviously better understand the entire biodiversity that we have. So it's complex because we have to get in there and actually do all the data collection, but it's an opportunity for us. As I see, you know, these projects going in, we're actually going to be collecting data on all these different ecosystems where nobody has gone in before to collect all the data. So that's really contributing to our understanding of the biodiversity in these different regions. And just, you know, for us last year, for example, we launched, you know, environmental DNA studies, just, you know, doing water samplings across our site, because we were trying to understand proactively where fish were actually around our area, which could help us right away proactively determine, you know, as we're building, you know, towards a potential mine plan, where are the areas to avoid and not avoid already from using those types of technologies, and always constantly have that conversation back and forth with the available tools and try to really do this in parallel ultimately versus waiting for something to be done on the engineering side and then saying, you know, this is what's there. So yeah, lots of opportunities in these types of remote environments. So.
Okay. Anyone else on biodiversity, or do we charge on?
I think that's been done brilliantly.
Yeah, well covered.
Well, you know, and one interesting thing, Ecologo, they have a whole as well, biodiversity, that's part of their components. You are given guides and you're supposed to distribute them across your teams, and there's, you know, species, if there's species of concern, it's all listed. So right away at the core, at the exploration phase, people are learning to be aware of the species where they're at, and there's a, you know, an exchange of data that happens, and you know, obviously for us it's caribou, so sightings are tracked, and it's already that understanding of the importance of that is already embedded, you know, from the get-go, which is great. So.
I mean, I was just listening to Andre Gaumond's film about the cleanup up in the north in Nunavut, and it was just so interesting to see the impact of the biodiversity side with regards to the relationship with the underlying First Nations groups up there, and the impact that has happened. So, I mean, I think all of this is so interconnected that you end up improving, or hopefully improving, your social license by bringing all of this together.
Okay, and I mean, listen, reclamation is a big thing that maybe doesn't get talked about enough in this sector. Is there important strides being made on the reclamation front? Alexis, over to you. What do you see?
I think that's something that we under talk about, you know, the importance of reclamation, repurposing of the sites. It's part of our license to operate, or we should say privilege to develop a mine, and I believe that we have very good example to show that it could be done very well, but we need to showcase that much more instead of trying to avoid the discussion of closure. I think the closure discussion should start at the beginning of a project, and you need to bring with you in that discussion the community, the indigenous people, very, very early on.
Is that starting to happen more, or are you still seeing it being kicked down the road?
We do that at Raglan Mine, for example. We have a closure committee that is operating, even if we have 25 years of life at the moment. We still have that committee meeting every year with the community to talk about it, and also to make people, remind them that a mine is there today, providing plenty of, you know, economic spin-offs, but it won't be eternal. And that's part of our social responsibility early on, to explain that a mine is not eternal. Okay. And we need to prepare ourselves for the after mining, not only in terms of environment, but also in terms of social impact.
Well, that's a good segue into stakeholder thinking, because an ancillary of ESG talk is often about broadening how we think about mine development and exploration to a stakeholder perspective. And it sounds nice, but oftentimes stakeholders is a wide basket of different individuals with different interests, and those interests can be competing. So at the, you know, not wanting to get into lip service, and Jamie, I want to first come to you on this. That's a very complex thing to really think about stakeholders. How does a mining company best manage that complexity?
How do we best manage the stakeholders? I mean, I think consistency in your communication is, I mean, I'm coming from the angle that I'm coming from. I think this could come from multiple different angles. But consistency in your approach of communication, which is credible, which is future-looking, which outlines the plans of the future, and therefore obviously accountability to meet that. So I think from a stakeholder management point of view, I think one of the problems with ESG over the course of the last few years is it's developed and evolved so quickly from a disclosure and reporting point of view, that almost without any regulations around it, you know, with the rating agencies, they didn't have any regulation, everything, so it became very confusing. So a lot of people have kind of, from a stakeholder point of view, it is very inefficient in terms of getting that messaging out to the different stakeholder groups. It could be from an M&A and banking point of view, it could be from local communities, it could be to regulators and all of this. So that is it's a minefield, and therefore trying to bring this together in an efficient, credible, communicative fashion, which people can have trust and confidence in on a future-looking basis, I think is really important.
those principles. Come in, Heather,
Yeah,
please.
when it comes to looking at all the stakeholders, I think that's when your materiality assessment really comes in, figuring out which topics are most material, not just to you internally, but having that conversation with all your stakeholders, whether it's your board, whether it's, for us, in our case, our mining partners, whether it's government, it's all of those stakeholders involved, so you really have a good understanding of what is material to you.
Okay. I think our panels here, our esteemed panelists, are all, I think, pragmatists. Would you all describe yourself as pragmatists? No, maybe not.
What was that?
Pragmatists?
Yeah, for sure.
Because where I'm going with this is, a key part of this is setting internal goals within your company, even outside the standards. And I would think they have to be practical, achievable goals, or we're going to run into a lot of problems. And Heather, I want to come to you on this, stay with you on this one first, and then Jamie will come, and we'll come down the line on this one. What's the thinking on Osisko around internal goals and how you keep them achievable?
Well, that's a tricky one when it comes to Osisko, so let's put that aside for just 1 second. And I think when you're setting goals, everybody knows that SMART acronym. You want to set specific, you want to set measurable, you want to set achievable, you want to set relevant, and you want to set time-bound goals. And I think that's pretty standard. When it comes to us, we're in a really tricky position because there's only so much that we're in control of. Right? And so we just came out with our inaugural climate change strategy for 2024 to 2027, and we didn't set a net zero target. We didn't set an emissions reduction target because a lot of our peers have, and that's great, and it may work for them. But if someone's saying, "Oh, we have zero Scope 1 emissions, we're going to reduce those by 50%."
Yeah.
Like, what kind of a goal or target is that? And so we struggle. We struggle with, should we set them, should we not? But I think, again, if you're looking at the broader scope of things, then making sure that they're those SMART goals is important.
Jamie, what do you see in the industry? Do you see companies that do this very well? Can you share some examples?
If I may, I'm going to slightly digress, but as a result of this question.
Okay.
So yesterday there was an announcement in the FT to say that $40 billion has been taken out of ESG funds. This sector should celebrate that. And the reason it should celebrate that is because sustainability is now embedded within due diligence.
Right.
And it's embedded throughout all funds. So if we're going to bring new funds into this sector, particularly with millennials becoming part of the fund management group now and everything else like that, we should be celebrating this because the opportunity to now get mining back into generalist funds. And if you go back to what the legend said the other day on this panel, they asked for more money from government, they asked for higher commodity prices, they asked for shorter permitting, and they asked for generalists. That's not going to sort out the problems of this sector. We have an identity crisis. What we do need to do is to go out to these investors and ask them, what do you need in order to invest in the sector? And that comes back to goals and KPIs and all the rest of it, which is what you're asking for. I'm really excited by that. But at the moment, we're ineligible. We're less than 2% of funds under management. That is a disastrous situation, but we've got a really exciting future. This is well structured now. I think the convergence of a lot of the regulatory side is really beginning to help this. I think there's much more focus and responsible development and production and sourcing of materials is absolutely for and embedded within all of this due diligence. So we should definitely celebrate. I'm going to finish on a quote from Adam Matthews, who, if anybody doesn't know Adam Matthews, he's the head sustainability person at the Church of England. He was the person behind the Tailings Initiative, which I think has really brought this sector into where we are today in a much better way. And he said yesterday is we need to recognize that investors are not properly valuing this sector, and in particular, those companies developing the most socially responsible approaches. Now, if we take that one thing forward, and he's leading this Mining 2030 Commission, that's 90 different institutions across the globe. If he can begin to take this thing forward with some of these KPIs and goals and solutions to go forward, we've got a really exciting future.
Excellent. I love ending. We are out of time, but what a great positive note to end on. Unless anyone had one last thing that they had to get off of their chest. Geneviève, go ahead.
I'll just add to what you're saying, because I think right now the opportunity with the critical minerals is to demonstrate to the world that we can do this responsibly. So for us, we went through a self strategy kind of process, and we came out with our mission, defining our mission, producing the world's minerals in the way that the world demands them. And from that comes different values, sharing, it's respect, it's collaboration, all that. And I think it is our opportunity now, I think, with the critical mineral space to demonstrate to the world that we are trying to set exemplary standards in what we're doing. And everybody's trying hard to decarbonize the planet ultimately, but mining is a part of that and a solution. So I think we need to celebrate that and continue to demonstrate that we are trying to do good. So.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Audience, please join me in thanking our panelists for their time and their thoughts today. Thank you very much, all of you.
Thanks. Cheers.